Greetings, fellow travelers through the liturgical year. This is Lisa Davis with an Advent season quick take on the Feast of St. Nicholas. Everyone knows St. Nick, right? The jolly old elf with the sleigh full of toys. This is not that St. Nicholas. Or rather, it would be more accurate to say that the modern picture of this saint is a far cry from the real man, the saint. Sad but true, when most people hear the name St. Nicholas, they immediately picture the icon of the Western world's commercial culture as described by Clement C. Moore. He was dressed all in fur from his head to his foot, and his clothes were all tarnished with ashes and soot. A bundle of toys he had flung on his back, and he looked like a peddler just opening his pack. His eyes, how they twinkled, his dimples, how merry! His cheeks were like roses, his nose like a cherry. His droll little mouth was drawn up like a bow, and the beard on his chin was as white as the snow. One of the most widely recognized poems in the English language, A Visit from St. Nicholas, was first published anonymously in the New York Sentinel in December of 1823. As viral as a thing could get in the early 19th century, this poem single-handedly resurrected the name of this great ancient saint, which had been temporarily lost or forgotten by the general public due to the destruction of the Protestant revolt. But heaven is timeless. The record of sanctity that is the heart of the faith lives on in spite of the times, and the memory of the original St. Nicholas has lived on untouched in the liturgical year of the true Church. The Novus Ordo demoted St. Nicholas in 1969, along with 92 other saints, removing his feast day from their calendar, but his renown is not so easily crushed. Even before the Clement Moore poem boosted his name recognition in America, the fame of this ancient saint had deep worldwide roots. St. Nicholas is part of our spiritual DNA, whether people realize it or not. The old country customs in much of Europe have survived in homely hamlets and villages who celebrate the day almost like a Christmas in miniature, complete with mitred bishop. But in the world where the Western spirit has overwhelmed ancient tradition, the religious meaning has been diluted, and to most Americans anyway, the dignified archbishop, champion against heresy, powerhouse of fasting and penance, the soul of charity, has survived only as a caricature, immortalized in a poem, then picked up by mass media as a convenient advertiser and distributor of material goods. In the timeline of church history, it happened practically overnight. In the 1800s, remember, poets were the superstars or the influencers of the era. After 1500 years, the holy Bishop Nicholas was suddenly a jolly old elf with a sleigh and flying reindeer, and there was no stopping the viral trend once it got going. In the 1860s, Thomas Nast added to the identity theft with his series of Christmas illustrations in Harper's Weekly, one of the most widely circulated magazines of the day in America. And the rest is history. In 150 years, the vision of St. Nicholas as a jolly old elf has become synonymous with the season, used to market in catalog wish books and all sorts and sundry of other advertising, perhaps most famously in recent decades by Coca-Cola. An entirely fictional character, St. Nicholas has morphed into the popular, beloved figure recognized the world over as Santa Claus. Which begs the question, how did the name change come about? How did we get from Clement C. Moore's clearly named St. Nicholas to the ubiquitous title Santa Claus? Well, if you know your Latin languages, you know that Santa is a mouthmush of sancta, which of course means holy, and that sounds hopeful, right? At least there's some link back to St. Nicholas. But what does Claus come from? It's generally accepted that the title in toto is a derivative of the Dutch nickname for St. Nicholas, which is Sinterklaas. coming from its homeland in the mouths of the natives of the Netherlands, Belgium, Luxembourg, Western Germany, Northern France, and Hungary. So you can hear it. Sinterklaas, in its anglicized version, became Santa Claus. If we squint our eyes and use our imaginations, we can still see the common ancestor. But how much of the original, the person and the concept, has actually survived? What do you know about the original St. Nicholas? And here's the first question. Having already brought up the Thomas Nast illustrations, let's tackle the obvious. What did St. Nicholas really look like? I probably don't need to tell you that he didn't look like Thomas Nast's drawings, or Coca-Cola's, or Rankin Bass. St. Nicholas was a 4th century ecclesiastic, a native of Patara, a coastal town in present-day Turkey, who ultimately became the Bishop of Myra, a neighboring city in Turkey. If you traveled back in a time machine and happened to bump into Bishop Nicholas, you'd more likely mistake him for an actor in Julius Caesar than the jolly old elf we've come to expect. You see, in St. Nicholas's time, Myra was a Greek province of the Roman Empire, and though its customs and traditions leaned toward an Eastern influence, the general raiment of its citizens would have consisted chiefly of tunics and togas, not trousers. And southern Turkey being in the warmer temperate zone, our bishop would not likely have been dressed all in fur from his head to his foot, even in the middle of winter. According to the Catholic Encyclopedia, at the time that St. Nicholas presided over the See of Myra, the typical garb of a bishop would not have included a bishop's mitre, as mitres didn't begin to be worn until after the 10th century. It's likely, in fact, that his clerical vestments may not have differed at all from his street clothes, as this differentiation didn't start to occur until after the time of Constantine, well into the 4th century. And it wasn't regularized throughout the church until a couple centuries after the death of St. Nicholas. So, what about the color red? It's possible that a bishop would have worn the typical dyed fabrics of the day, which ranged across the spectrum. We may be inclined to imagine that folks from before the first millennia resembled tea-dyed woodcuttings, but textile arts were beautifully advanced in those days, and clothes, even of humble people, were dyed almost all the colors of the rainbow, using tints found in nature. So St. Nicholas could very well have worn red, but the colors associated with clergy had not evolved before the 5th century, so it would have been a random choice. Not to be neglectful of the importance of symbolism, however. The choice of red for Santa Claus is actually an appropriate nod to St. Nicholas the Bishop. In his iconography, we commonly find St. Nicholas depicted wearing red because red is the traditional color of bishops. So Santa gets that right. And even though St. Nicholas lived before the accoutrements of a bishop had been standardized, it's appropriate for him to be shown with the mitre and crozier of more modern times, as his office in the church is a key part of his identity. The symbolism used by the church for its saints is timeless and isn't intended to reflect historically accurate attire. So, back to the question. We can guess what he might have worn, but what did St. Nicholas look like? This is one of the most amazing things about St. Nicholas, Bishop of Myra. We do actually know with fairly historic accuracy what he looked like. By the will of God, St. Nicholas is one of the few ancient saints whose entire skeletal relics can be accounted for. Buried for centuries in a crypt of the Basilica di San Nicola in Bari, Italy, the remains of St. Nicholas were unearthed, so to speak, during a chapel restoration in the 1950s. In respectful consideration of the preciousness of the relic, but wishing to have an accurate record of them, the Archdiocese of Bari permitted a group of carefully chosen scientists to photograph and measure the bones of St. Nicholas. In doing so, among other things, they discovered that he was a man not tall of stature, and that he had sustained injuries during his life that had subsequently healed. But most fascinating of all, since the skull was intact, scientists, with the use of modern forensic technology, have been able to reconstruct what St. Nicholas may have looked like in real life. Based on the earliest icons of our saint, shown here, either the forensic scientists' results or the drawings of the iconographers are amazingly accurate, or both. What do you think? So St. Nicholas, Bishop of Myra, was only 5 feet 6 inches tall, only slightly taller than I am. He had a strong square jaw and a, quote, severely broken nose that had healed asymmetrically, end quote. This last documented fact about our saint, I'm sure, brings up some questions. Folks familiar with St. Nicholas's life, or those who have been exposed to Catholic memes, have probably heard of the legend of the famous punch. If you haven't heard, stay tuned for a minute or two. The obvious question is whether his broken nose might be connected to a violent altercation of some kind, like sometime around the Council of Nicea. Here is the quick take on Bishop Nicholas's real life story. Hint: flying reindeer and elves are not the only mythology that has grown up around our saint over the centuries. The real St. Nicholas was a holy and well-loved member of the clergy of the early church, known for his courage and defense of the faith during the persecutions of Diocletian. He was imprisoned for his faith during the reign of Diocletian and released when Constantine took over the Roman Empire. But after the persecutions ended, the work didn't end for the early church leaders. St. Nicholas, in his see at Myra, was particularly employed in the work of defeating the scourge of paganism among the Greek people. Toward this end, he is known to have brought about the destruction of many pagan temples in his diocese, most notably that of the Temple of Artemis in Lycia. But very few details of his life have come down to us without question through these mists of time. Much of St. Nicholas' life is based on legend and hagiography that calls itself undependable. We do know for a fact that St. Nicholas attended the Council of Nicea in the year 325, and for his staunch defense of the doctrine of the Blessed Trinity, he earned the title of Defender of Orthodoxy, a title still particularly remembered in the Eastern Church. This is where the famous punch comes in. During the Nicene Council, which had been called to settle the problem of the Arian heresy, legend has it that St. Nicholas became so frustrated with the foolishness of the arguments against the Blessed Trinity that during the debates he flew across the room and punched Arius, his chief opponent, in the face. Some accounts call it a slap, others a punch, but there are no records from this time that verify this transaction. In no document, letter, diary, or passing account of the time is it recorded. It's not mentioned in Butler's, or in the liturgical year, or in the breviary, or in the old dusty Catholic encyclopedia, or in any of the many biographical sequences written for his masses throughout the millennia. Without any doubt, St. Nicholas was a threat to the devil. He was a champion against heresy in his own diocese, and as an official representative present during the Council of Nicea. But the memes are mistaken. His boxing gloves were all most definitely not literal. Despite the evidence of his crooked nose, I have little doubt that St. Nicholas was a man perfectly able to keep his temper and highly unlikely to punch someone during a council of all places. But that he was the victim of violence is almost sure. Most scholars attribute the broken nose and other signs of injuries detected among his bones to the ill treatment he received during his imprisonment under Diocletian. Not because he was a brawler of some kind, but you can see how the stories must have started. The punch of Arian is a legend that won't die easily, I'm afraid. If only for the contrast to the powdered sugar Santa Claus image that has dogged St. Nicholas in recent decades, I think the picture of wiry little St. Nicholas punching out the evil heretic Arius is somewhat cathartic and satisfyingly manly. Wouldn't most of us like to imagine we'd have the courage to punch out a heretic if necessary ourselves? But this isn't how the Church defeats heresy. Lies are vanquished by truth. And in the interest of truth, I think St. Nicholas wouldn't want to be known for throwing that imaginary punch any more than he'd want to be known for a Coca-Cola ad. What, then, is the verifiably true and official story of St. Nicholas of Myra? From the pages of the '07 Catholic Encyclopedia, I quote, "Though he is one of the most popular saints in the Greek as well as the Latin Church, there is scarcely anything historically certain about St. Nicholas, except that he was the Bishop of Myra in the 4th century. Some of the main points of his legend are as follows. He was born at Patara, city of Lycia in Asia Minor. In his youth, he made a pilgrimage to Egypt and Palestine. Shortly after his return, he became the Bishop of Myra. Cast into prison during the persecution of Diocletian, he was released after the accession of Constantine, and was present at the Council of Nicea. In 1087, Italian merchants stole his body at Myra, bringing it to Bari in Italy. The numerous miracles St. Nicholas is said to have wrought both before and after his death are outgrowths of a long tradition." End quote. So, hey, wait a minute. Does this mean that the legends that have grown from long tradition are untrue? By no means. It does not mean that. In fact, some of them are related in the breviary. The legends of St. Nicholas were first collected and written in Greek by Metaphrastes in the 10th century, and though we don't have official historical verification of them, the stories have been recorded and shared in prose, poetry, and song all through the ages of the Church since his time. Here is the account given in the breviary. Quote, "Nicholas was born of a noble family at Patara in the province of Lycia. His birth was the fruit of his parents' prayers. Evidence of his great future holiness was given from his very cradle. Having lost his parents when he was a boy, he gave all his goods to the poor. Of his Christian kind-heartedness there is the following noble example. One of his fellow citizens had 3 daughters, but being too poor to obtain them an honorable marriage, he was minded to abandon them to a life of profligacy. Nicholas, having come to know the case, went to the house during the night, and threw in by the window a sum of money sufficient for the dower of one of the daughters. He did the same a second and a third time, and thus the 3 were married to respectable men." End quote. From this legend originated the custom of hanging stockings at Christmas time. In some tellings, the good saint slipped the gifts into the socks or shoes, drying by the fire. On Christmas, we recall the stockings. On the feast of St. Nicholas, the custom falls on the shoes. And the gift of chocolate gold pieces or chocolate oranges or just oranges, which have been considered a suitable substitute for gold in some times, recalls the original gift of the dowry money. The breviary continues, sharing the story that has given rise over the centuries to St. Nicholas's patronage of seagoing men. Quote, "Having given himself wholly to the service of God, Nicholas set out for Palestine, that he might visit and venerate the holy places. During this pilgrimage, which he made by sea, he foretold to the mariners on embarking, though the heavens were serene and the sea tranquil, that they would be overtaken by a frightful storm. In a very short time the storm arose. All were in the most imminent danger, when he quelled it by his prayers." At the end of this pilgrimage, the Church tells us that St. Nicholas returned to Myra, quote, "giving to all men an example of the greatest sanctity. He went by an inspiration from God to Myra, the metropolis of Lycia, which had just lost its bishop by death, and the bishops of the province had come together for the purpose of electing a successor. Whilst they were holding council for the election, they were told by a revelation from heaven that they should choose him who on the morrow should be the first to enter the church, his name being Nicholas. Accordingly, the requisite observations were made. When they found Nicholas to be waiting at the church door, they took him, and to the incredible delight of all, made him the bishop of Myra. During his episcopate, he never flagged in the virtues looked for in a bishop. Chastity, which indeed he had always preserved, gravity, assiduity in prayers, watchings, abstinence, generosity and hospitality, meekness in exhortation, severity in reproving. He befriended widows and orphans by money, by advice, and by every service in his power. So zealous a defender was he of all who suffered oppression, that in one occasion 3 tribunes, having been condemned by the Emperor Constantine, who had been deceived by calumny, but having heard of the miracles wrought by Nicholas, the tribunes recommended themselves to his prayers, though he was living at a very great distance from that place. The saint appeared to Constantine, and looking angrily upon him, obtained from the terrified emperor their deliverance. The quote continues, "Having, contrary to the edict of Diocletian and Maximian, preached in Myra the truth of the Christian faith, Nicholas was taken up by the servants of the 2 emperors. He was taken off to a great distance and thrown into prison, where he remained until Constantine, having become emperor, ordered his release, and the saint returned to Myra. Shortly afterward, he repaired to the council which was being held at Nicea. There he took part with the 318 fathers in condemning the Arian heresy. Scarcely had he returned to his see than he was taken with the sickness of which he soon died, in December of the year 343. End quote. And not to belabor the point, and I know I'm being somewhat repetitive, but this is the Saint Nicholas we should be remembering today, the one recorded for us in the official prayers of the Church. He was a good, holy, virtuous man and a bishop of the Church, distinguished by God for miracles so prevalent that their fame has survived almost 2 millennia. So here's another question. If St. Nicholas's episcopal see was in Myra, and he lived and died in Myra, why is he sometimes called St. Nicholas of Bari? When St. Nicholas died on December 6th in the year 343, his body was, naturally, entombed in Myra, his home and his parish, so he is rightfully referred to using this distinction. But his travels didn't actually end in the year 343. Fast forward about 700 years to the late 11th century. The world has entered the era of the Crusades, and the Muslims have invaded and taken over the town of Myra, including the ancient church of St. Nicholas, which had been built over the tomb of our saint less than 200 years after his death. We're entering here the era of the Crusades. The Catholic world is mourning the insult of its holy places falling into the hands of the invading Muslims, but some courageous men were not wasting their time mourning. They were springing into action. Now remember, St. Nicholas is the patron saint of sailors, and no sailor worth his salt was going to take an insult to St. Nicholas lying down. Long story short, it didn't take long before a ship from Bari, Italy, landed near the Lycian coast, somehow made its way past the sentinels of the Mohammedans, found its way into the ancient church, and removed the relics right from under the noses of the Muslims and the Catholic monks still guarding them. Miraculously, the sailors made it all the way back to Bari, where the relics remain to this day. In apparent divine approval of this translation, many miracles are reported to have occurred at the installation of the relics at their new home. Within a century, a beautiful basilica, the Basilica di San Nicola, was completed in Bari to house the relics in honor, and the site became known as a great pilgrimage center in the Middle Ages. But that's not the only end of this story. For centuries, Venice contested Bari's claim to the relics of St. Nicholas. To this day, you can visit the relics of St. Nicholas not only in the Basilica di San Nicola in Bari, but in the Church of San Nicola di Lido, which is on the 7-mile-long barrier island of Venice. So you might ask, who really has the relics of St. Nicholas? It's true that, as I just related, the chief parts of the relics of St. Nicholas were removed shortly after the Muslim takeover of Myra in 1071, when they were hurriedly packed up, probably in the dark, and in the midst of some confusion and desperation, and hustled back with more good intention than decorum to Bari. And the story continues. Some years later, toward the end of the First Crusade, another ship of well-intentioned Christian sailors arrived in Myra to also save the day. Remember that in the first millennium, news didn't travel fast, and the fact that other sailors had already saved the day would not have been general knowledge. And St. Nicholas, as we said, being the patron of sailors, all good Catholic seamen had a vested interest in saving his bones from the Muslims. So, turn the record over and play it again. Within a few years of the first rescue, another motley crew of Italian sailors imposed upon the monks of Myra, who had been unable to maintain a strong presence at the ancient Church of St. Nicholas, due of course to the territory being occupied by the infidels. The story goes on that this second group of sailors found within the confines of the church 3 well-protected boxes, by all indications containing the remains of St. Nicholas, as well as his uncle, another St. Nicholas, and a St. Theodore. So bingo! Stealthily, they hefted the boxes upon their shoulders and headed back to the ship. But upon being relocated to the ship and examined, the boxes were discovered to be decoys. It isn't recorded how they knew it, but the sailors somehow knew that they'd been had, and returned to the Church of St. Nicholas, determined to try again. You can imagine the scene. The whole expedition would have been carried on under the noses of the Muslims, so it was likely in the dark of night that they once again snuck through the streets of Myra and slipped into the shadowy cavern of the ancient church. We can assume the remaining handful of monks left to protect the holy treasure had been hiding in the background at the beginning of the raid, and watching the sailors disappear into the night with the decoys, hoped and prayed they'd seen the last of them. How dismaying it must have been when these pesky Italians returned. And though the good monks' prayers would certainly have been for God's will to be done, how depressing, after all their trouble, to see which way the wind of the divine will was blowing when, as the sailors searched, a sudden heavenly aroma began wafting around the church, an atmosphere usually characteristic only of dust, must, and moldering age. There had been no burning of incense since the Muslims invaded. This perfume could only have come from heaven. The monks, no doubt, sighed in resignation, and you can imagine the sailors signing themselves with the cross, following the scent to one particular hidden corner of the church, then breaking through the flagstone there and digging several feet down, all the while enveloped with the unearthly aroma, until they find a copper urn engraved with the words, "Here lies the great Bishop Nicholas, glorious on land and sea." Legend says the sailors, not insensitive to the mess they'd left the monks, donated a large sum of money to cover the cost of repair to the church. Let's hope they really did. And they took the urn with the relics back to the ship, ultimately to be enshrined in the church in Venice, where the Venetians would look askance at the Bari claim to have St. Nicholas, and the citizens of Bari would thumb their noses at the ridiculous claim that Venice had St. Nicholas. No kidding. It was an 891-year grudge, each side blessing the other with one hand while making the universal symbol of loco with the other. until the end of the 20th century, when scientists examining both sets of relics determined that whoever it was, and they wouldn't weigh in on that, but whoever it was, scientific testing proved that the relics at both sites belonged to the same person. And we know who that was. Mystery solved. Historians surmise that in their haste to procure the relics, the first sailors, those of the Bari vessel, were a little less than careful, and stepped upon, broke, and shattered some of the bones of the body of St. Nicholas, leaving a number of fragments behind in the tomb. The monks, in the aftermath of being attacked from all sides, had been consoled to have at least some pieces of their holy relic, and took extra steps to prevent losing them again, which appears to not have been the will of God. One can only speculate that perhaps, had the Bari and Venetian sailors never dropped anchor on the coast near Myra, the relics might have fallen into the hands of the Muslims. And so it was perhaps for this reason that God allowed for all the relics, including the final remnants, to be removed and fought about for a millennium. God bless our Italians. But we now know the truth, and hopefully the Venetians and the folks from Bari have, maybe a little sheepishly, shaken hands over the whole affair. An even more amazing but little known fact concerning the relics of St. Nicholas is the flow of miraculous oil that has persisted in his tomb from the earliest days, beginning in Myra over 1,500 years ago, and continuing after the translation of the relics to Bari. This oil, called the myrrh of St. Nicholas, is reported to proceed from the relics in Bari, even to this day, and is accompanied by many accounts of miraculous healings. St. Nicholas's true and enduring gift to the world has been his holy example, his continuing intercession, and as if that weren't enough, miraculous holy oil. Next question. What are the patronages of St. Nicholas, and where is he still revered? St. Nicholas is the patron saint of sailors, bankers, pawnbrokers, scholars, orphans, laborers, travelers, merchants, judges, paupers, marriageable maidens, captives, victims of judicial errors, perfumers, and of course, children. No small number of his legendary miracles and works of charity were for the benefit of children. Our affection for this saint has spread naturally due to his universal appeal to children and their families, but his patronage of mariners has added to this worldwide renown, as it stands to reason that sailors, as voyagers, spread his fame throughout the world from the earliest days of his cultus. St. Nicholas chapels were built in many seaports. As his popularity spread during the Middle Ages, St. Nicholas became the patron saint of Apulia, Italy, Lorraine, France, Sicily, Greece, many cities in Germany, Austria, Switzerland, Italy, Belgium, and the Netherlands. He is also well loved throughout Russia, as after his conversion to the faith in 988, St. Vladimir the Great of Russia introduced St. Nicholas's stories and devotions to his homeland. St. Nicholas has been through the ages so widely revered that thousands of churches have been named for him, including 300 in Belgium, 34 in Rome, 23 in the Netherlands, and more than 400 in England. His popularity crosses borders of time, space, and denomination. Not only do we celebrate his feast day on the Roman Catholic calendar, but he's represented in Eastern Orthodox, Oriental Orthodox, Anglican, and Lutheran calendars. There are still many worldwide traditions associated with St. Nicholas the Saint. In Catholic countries throughout the world, from Argentina to Ukraine, St. Nicholas maintains his religious significance in traditional festivals and other observances revolving around the feast day, with processions and masses taking at least some part in the celebrations. In many homes in America even, especially among traditional Catholics and by circumstances especially beloved in homeschooling families, I have to mention that because it's just true, the old European custom lives on for the feast day. Chocolate coins, new socks or mittens, and a holy card may appear compliments of St. Nicholas in the shoes of the children, who may imagine that the good bishop has happened by, resembling maybe his secular counterpart. He could certainly have white whiskers and almost definitely a twinkle in his eye, but he also comes complete with a mitre and a crozier, and that might be as much as many of us imagine, at least in America. But if you were to ask an Austrian child about St. Nicholas, you might be surprised at the details he'd add. In Belgium, Germany, and Poland in particular, St. Nicholas makes his legendary rounds on a beautiful white horse, though in France, Luxembourg, Belgium, and Switzerland, he's more likely to be riding a donkey, with side baskets filled with gifts. In some traditions, St. Nicholas is accompanied by angels, but particularly in Austria, the Bavarian Alps, and in some places in Eastern Europe, St. Nicholas's companion is not so benign. St. Nicholas is, of course, a symbol of goodness and an encouragement to virtue out of love for goodness, but the servant, known as Krampus, that accompanies him in some lore, represents evil, or perhaps more properly explained, Krampus represents the motivation to do good to avoid the punishment of doing evil. In other words, you'd better behave yourself. Krampus will get you if you don't watch out. And believe me when I say you don't want this fellow to get you. Krampus and his counterparts, which hail by different names in different regions, are almost universally terrifying. When the Vatican II Church demoted this feast day in the 1960s, calling into question the existence of St. Nicholas, Catholics around the world knew better. The faithful in Bari, in Venice, in Myra, and devotees around the world were shocked at the announcement and appealed loudly about the removal of, among others, St. Christopher, St. George, St. Barbara, and St. Philomena, but especially about St. Nicholas. To appease the kickback, the Novus Ordo remained firm about the other 90 or so demoted saints, but felt forced to change their language about St. Nicholas in particular, because the people were just not having it. The official verbiage in the conciliar church today is that St. Nicholas was not officially removed from the calendar, but that Novus Ordo Catholics can choose to observe his feast day or not. His halo was not necessarily removed, but you can call it a hat if you want to. It's shameful, isn't it? And a little absurd. They'd have you believe that the, air quote, wisdom of the 20th century is greater than the wisdom of the church over the last 2,000 years, where all our traditional saints existed in honor, not by default, but by divine will. It's no accident that the devotion to these saints has thrived over the centuries, and far from dying out, persisted in spite of the Novus Ordo's efforts, in spite of the corruption of the secular world. St. Augustine tells us, "Truth is like a lion. You don't have to defend it. Let it loose. It will defend itself." St. Christopher, St. Barbara, St. Philomena, and St. Nicholas continue to speak for themselves. Far from being the two-dimensional cartoon spokesman for consumerism that our not-so-wise world has made of him, St. Nicholas remains as ever himself in spite of our foolishness. Santa Claus is Santa Claus. I guess you can take him or leave him. You can guess how I feel about him, and I won't preach on the subject. But this I do insist upon. As someone who studies the lives of the saints and appreciates them more every day, Santa Claus aside, St. Nicholas was a real person, a holy bishop, a saintly shepherd of the faithful, whose intercession we stand in need of in our jaded and faithless era, an era when souls are falling into hell like snowflakes. It's incumbent upon us as Catholics to maintain and nurture this and all links with the truth and the history of our faith. When we honor the saints, all the saints, we benefit by their greatest influence, the example of their lives, the obstacles and faults they overcame, their love of God, and the good they did for the love of God, which was the fruit of their lives of prayer, work, and penance. And so it is with Saint Nicholas, Bishop of Myra, citizen of the 4th century, but still a part of our lives in the 21st century. We know his name. He would want us to know the truth of his life, the real reason he's been honored by the Church for so many centuries, the real reason God has allowed his fame to persevere. By all means, we should enjoy the gift-giving customs connected with his feast day. But if we really want to please St. Nicholas, we'd give our children more than just chocolate. We'd take their hands and travel together with today's holy bishop through the season of Advent, making tracks of goodness with St. Nicholas to the crib in Bethlehem. Happy blessed feast of St. Nicholas, and best wishes for a fruitful Advent from all of us here at Catholic Family Podcast. Blessed be God in his angels and in his saints.
Is